Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this month's Digging In with TPS-MTSU. We're really excited to have you join us for this month's webinar. A couple quick things for just a quick reminders. One, again, for those of you joining us live, be sure to keep your mics muted. And again, we love for these to be interactive, which is, again, the bonus for those who can join us live. Open the chat box, introduce yourself. Feel free to ask questions, make comments, chat with us throughout the presentations as we will be responding to that. I think that does make webinars a bit more interesting when you can participate and again get the side conversation that's going on besides just listening to the presentations itself. And again, we do have our Padlet, which you can access using the QR code or this link. And we continue to add resources to that for each of the different webinars within this Digging In series. So there's, again, a lot of great information and material available through that Padlet link. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Stacy to talk to us about this month's theme and get us started.
All right, thanks, Kira. This month, we went with an American Revolution theme, which we have done before, so this is volume 2. But it's particularly timely now because we and different organizations across the whole state and country are gearing up to create materials and events along the lines of the 250th anniversary well, technically it'll be the Declaration of Independence in 2026, but there are so many other things to commemorate having to do with that revolutionary period and the birth of our nation. So we will be talking about this in a lot of our upcoming workshops and trying to get a lot of those excellent resources from the Library of Congress on this period into your hands and into your classrooms for your easier use. So in the theme box right here, talking there is a link where it says the 250th anniversary events, which, by the way, it's called the semi-quincentennial, which of course means half of 500. So you can use that at your next trivia game. But the first link takes you to the official site for America's 250th kind of, what they're doing, the big shindigs. And there's a countdown clock, as you can see, 2 years, 7 months, and 25 days until our country's 250-year birthday. So you may want to check out and see what they've got on there, or at least bookmark it and refer back to it in the next 2 years because they'll be adding more materials there. Now, because this is volume 2, we have done an issue in our newsletter of the American Revolution before, and you can get to that from this link down here. And we've also done other related issues from this time period, including one on the Founding Fathers and one on the founding documents. And so all those things are kind of related and from this very kind of momentous period of the American Revolution. And we're going to talk a bit more about all the other resources that are in this newsletter kind of at the end of this episode. But I will say that there's no way they could all fit onto this newsletter. We did put quite a few in the important links box like we always do. But this is just barely the tip of the iceberg. And part of the reason is because the Library of Congress has so much from this time period. So it's actually extremely helpful and useful. And, they have collections of papers from all the early presidents. And they have wonderful exhibits and blog articles about all the different issues kind of surrounding what the founding fathers were doing, what were the influences on the Declaration of Independence, and what were some of the economic and social contexts for that time period, and as well as just like the individuals involved. So there's just so much we could not possibly cover it in not even 2 newsletters. So again, stay tuned. We'll be covering a lot of this material and a lot of upcoming events over the next few years. But anyway, in this issue, though, we do have some good things for you. The awesome source of the month is this interesting little political cartoon with the horse America throwing his master, which looks like George III holding, one of those things that you use to get your horse to go faster. And he looks like he's about to be thrown right off. And so, pose a question to your students. What do you think this is from the American side or the British side? And we have 4 different lesson ideas, 3 of which we are going to be kind of going more in depth with you today. And then, of course, on the last page, we always have 4 additional primary sources that you can take a closer look at. The drafting the Declaration of Independence, of course, has links to some of those things I just referred to earlier, including a really great exhibit called Creating the United States that has a whole segment on creating the Declaration of Independence, which is very, very helpful. Here we have a blurb about a woman who fought as she dressed up like a man, and she fought in the Revolutionary Army until she was found out, Deborah Sampson. We're going to be hearing about another Revolutionary era woman later in this episode with Deja's lesson idea. There's a really wonderful collection of maps from the battles of the American Revolution, and you can get to that collection from this page as well. And then we have a remembrance of Crispus Attucks using this, featuring this really great painting that's not from the Revolutionary era. It's actually from the New Deal era. It was one of those murals painted during the New Deal in Washington, D.C. And so talking more about his role in the Boston Massacre. But the first one that we're going to go over today is Bunker Hill, the Battle of Bunker Hill. We don't usually like to do like straight on battle stories because we're more interested in cultural and political history, but you still need to learn about them and you still need to teach about them. And I thought Bunker Hill was interesting for a couple odd reasons, but one of the reasons is because is so iconic and well known that it has this very long afterlife in American memory. And this afterlife does not necessarily match up with the reality of the battle, as is the case in a lot of things. So, and it's interesting too, because this is one of the battles that was fought before the Declaration of Independence was even signed. So there's a handful of engagements that take place before kind of like the official military engagement. In fact, George Washington, I believe he had just accepted the commander-in-chief post, but he hadn't started it yet. So this is a very early part of the war. But in itself, it's a bit of a turning point because beforehand, you had Lexington and Concord, right? And that was just a case where the British regulars with their uniforms and their very well-disciplined troops, walk through trying to secure different little caches of ammunition in different places. And then these like Minutemen, these scraggly bands of Minutemen they just shoot at each other for a few minutes. And then, one side, the American side, runs away. And so this kind of it does caused the British troops to pull back around Boston, but their impression of the American, I can't even call them soldiers at this point, right? Of the Americans, which aren't even Americans yet, right? Of the colonists, we'll just say colonists, is that they would never withstand any kind of formal military engagement whatsoever. And that would have been a very fair thing for them to think. So the Brits are like, what are they doing? They have no chance. And so the Battle of Bunker Hill actually causes them to reevaluate that earlier impression, because the Americans do manage to stand their ground through 2 very, very serious assaults on, well, it's not Bunker Hill, it's Breed's Hill, actually. a different location, but the Americans were very heavily fortified in this kind of high part of the Charlestown Peninsula, which is right across, of course, the coastline of modern day Boston is different from how it was in 1775 when there was more water there, and now today it's more built up and there's more wharfs and docks and all that kind of thing. So it's hard to imagine, Charlestown Peninsula across the strait from the Boston Peninsula, but the Charlestown Peninsula is where this fighting happens. And so the people in Boston, though, are still close enough they can like climb up to the top of their house and watch what's going on. So we actually have some eyewitness accounts of this from the American point of view. And but so the Americans managed to fortify the top of this hill. And it was actually Breed's Hill. And it was, is the kind of position where you would expect them to be able to defend it easily. But because the Americans were not really tried in battle yet, because the British troops were so disciplined and experienced, they thought, well, a direct frontal assault ought to do the trick, right? Of course, nowadays you don't do that. But the Brits tried twice and failed miserably. The third time they managed to take the hill, and when the Americans retreated back towards the neck that connected the peninsula to the mainland, they retreated across what is Bunker Hill. So that's why people think it's the Battle of Bunker Hill, because they know that the rearguard action took place on Bunker Hill was involved. But the monument to the battle is actually on Breed's Hill. I don't know, students like to correct history, so that might be something that they would get out of this. But so yes, the British actually suffered more casualties as a result of those onslaughts. And so they had a higher rate of casualties than the American side did. And so it was a victory for them because they managed to gain the territory that they were fighting over because the Americans retreated. But it wasn't much of a victory because they had to put way too much effort into doing it than they were prepared to do. So it made them realize, okay, this could be a long, protracted thing, and we're going to need to have a more organized way of dealing with these patriots, with these so-called patriots, and maybe even hire some mercenary soldiers. And so this is where the Hessian soldiers get pulled in and all that kind of thing as well. So it's a turning point in that sense militarily. There are links here in the second paragraph that you're looking at right now to an essay. If you want to start off what I just provided for you, providing some sort of kind of like summary of the battle for your students. There is a nice video on YouTube, which of course I can't show you right now, and it's well done. So you may want to engage them with that first, or there's this good exhibit from the Massachusetts Historical Society on the Battle of Bunker Hill. And so if you go to the tab that says the battle, it has this it has a write-up. So that's the kind of thing that it's not too long. Your students could read it for homework beforehand, or they could read it at the beginning of class or at least parts of it. There's also a really good timeline, which puts this in context of all the other things going on, especially that crucial year of 1775. The first primary source that we're going to look at is actually, we're not going to read it in this episode, but in the lesson, they look at one of those eyewitness accounts from somebody in Boston, and that somebody was Abigail Adams. And one of the other eyewitnesses was her son, who was like 8 or 10 at the time, John Quincy Adams, future US president. And so they're also from the same website. Under the documents, there's 10 contemporary accounts of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And so you can look at the letter here, but this does not have a transcription here. They didn't put it, they didn't link to it from this exhibit, but I linked to it from the newsletter. So if you go to the transcription link, you will be able to get to an easier to read version of her letter. And so you can talk about what are the impressions, what are the Americans thinking, how does she describe the effect of the battle on people's spirits? You know, are they starting to take sides? Are they starting to feel like, oh, we're in for a long war? Are they starting to feel like, oh my gosh, we might actually have a chance? So all those kinds of questions, because this is at the very beginning. But I also want to look at a long-term kind of legacy of the battle, and this has to do with memory. So we're getting outside of the Revolutionary period and kind of moving into the 19th century. And this is looking at a poster of the Bunker Hill Monument. And so that's what the primary source here is. And so I linked to an analysis sheet for students to analyze this poster, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Excuse me for a second. So you might want to, this is just a small JPEG. You might want to download the TIFF file if you're wanting to show them this on your screen. But basically they can remark on the shape of the monument. Like, does it remind you of anything? You know, what's that at the top? What are all these people doing? And it's a weird kind of way of depicting them and organizing them around this kind of graphic representation. So what, you know, here's the city of Boston. You see a lot of people on horseback. This is a parade that's commemorating the dedication of this monument. And this monument was a long time in making. They wanted to start making it on the 50-year anniversary, but they ran out of money, as is the case with so many monument building stories. And so it was finally dedicated in 1843. So this is a primary source for the dedication of this monument. So it's showing us how Bunker Hill is remembered by Americans in 1843, when, of course, our independence was well established. And, you know, before we realized we were going to be in the throes of a civil war to test our independence and democratic kind of strength. But so this is to kind of give them an idea of how do we remember our battles, and you know, why would all these people come out so long afterwards to dedicate a monument, and why this battle and not something else. So and then the last thing is I linked to some of the, there's several historic maps in the Library of Congress that are all really good, but I do link to one of them in particular because I think that the writing on this is easy to read, so students will be able to look at this and read the words and not be confused by 18th century handwriting, because all these maps, of course, would have been hand drawn at the time. And then they can look at it and go, ha, they called it Breed's Hill. I mean, they called it Bunker Hill instead of Breed's Hill, but also it'll help them visualize the battle. So here it looks like an island almost, but this is Charlestown. And this is the tiny little strip of land that connects it to the rest of Boston. You can see road from Cambridge. Cambridge, of course, you know, is still where it is today. And so they call this hill Breed's Hill, but this is actually Bunker Hill. And then they call this Bunker's Hill when this is actually Breed's Hill. So they got those mixed up. But the funny thing is, Abigail Adams got them mixed up in her letter too. So it wasn't just a British mistake. This was I guess nobody had reason to know what the names of these hills were unless you lived in Charlestown, right? And those poor residents of Charlestown, their whole town got put to the torch when the Brits landed and worked their way up. So here's the first landing and then the reinforcements, and then just were attacking the fortifications. So in any case, so that's, you know, it's a little bit of a hybrid lesson where you talk a little bit about military action, you talk about public perception, and then you talk about memory. But I think that when you're talking about iconic battles like that and something, as legendary as the American Revolution, you need to kind of look at it from a lot of different angles. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to turn things over to Deja to talk about something completely different, but from the same time period.
Thank you. Okay. So I am actually going to talk about Phyllis Wheatley, who made a pretty big mark in the war. She came in. Awesome, it shows up. She came at about 8 years old. There isn't a definite time period on a lot of I guess there's not a solid date for a lot of things in her life that happened. They have an idea of about 1753, which I will say I also did have a lot of difficulty just finding information on her outside of the official website. She was born in West Africa. The the common theme, they do all seem to think she's from around the Senegal area. And so when she was about 8 years old, she was captured and brought to Boston. And she was purchased by the Wheatley family. The husband, John, he was like a established tailor in Boston. And then his wife, Susanna, she actually brought Phyllis into the house. And fun fact, she was named after the boat that she was brought on, called the Phyllis. And she actually, contrary to the treatment of most slaves at the time, she was taught how to read. She actually even learned like classic Greek and Latin, all within a span of like less than 2 years, which I think is very interesting. Oh, uh-oh. And so, as a teenager, she sparked a lot of interest in poetry after a lot of inspiration from reading the Bible. She published her first poem in 1967, um, and it actually gave her a lot of notoriety. The elegate poem on the death of the celebrated divine George Whitefield, that actually kind of mourns the passing of George Whitefield, who was a well-known preacher for his influence on religion and evangelicalism in the colonies at the time. And then at about 20, she traveled to London and with like financial support of, I think she was the Duchess of, or the English Countess of Huntington. She actually traveled to London with the Wheatley Sun to publish these collection of poems. And what I actually think is also really cool is that the foreword was done by John Hancock and a number of notable Boston figures at the time, also published with her photo to show that it was a Black woman who was writing these poems, which is really cool. Very before its time, of course. And then following that specific publication, this collection that she did at 20 years old, she was emancipated. And then about a year after that, which I believe was like 1774, was when she was emancipated. In 75, she wrote a letter to George Washington, basically just giving props to him for his leadership during the war. And he actually missed her letter, which is pretty kind of sucks. But once he did receive it, he posted it in it was posted, or it was a letter first and then accompanied with the poem that was published in newspapers all across America. Um, and there are three specifically that I think are pretty notable in her career, which, of course, the first one is, which was in 67, which is to the University of Cambridge in New England. And that actually, she's addressing Harvard students, and it showcases kind of like her knowledge of classical literature. She's appealing and talking about like the need for knowledge and education, which again, she's way before her time in this when we're talking about any type of like slave slavery or anything like that, which I think is pretty cool. And then number two, which I actually have the full poem on the next slide. She's going to talk about her journey. It's a very short poem, but her journey from Africa to America and her experience. And then three, of course, the poem that came with that letter that she wrote to Washington also gained her a lot of notoriety across the country and really around the world, which I think is also, we don't see that a lot during this time period in terms of American history and Black women. And so here's the poem, and I'll read it. It's pretty quick. "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land. It taught me my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolical dye. Remember Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train." Which of course, it does show her conversion to Christianity. She acknowledges that, slavery was a pretty brutal experience that she had, but she still gives respect and honor to Christianity. Um, and it of course shows the ideas behind Christianity at the time. The idea of Negroes being black as Cain, I do think that's pretty interesting line there. And joining the angelic train as if, the best way for us to redeem ourselves is through Christianity. So I think that's pretty interesting. And then, which I found pretty interesting, like pretty cool, the life after the war, after her publications, information on her kind of just falls off. They have facts that she married John Peters, who was a free black man. But after 1776, she kind of just I guess her gravy train runs out, to say the least. She loses patrons, and she started facing a lot of financial difficulty, which is really sad. But not soon after it, I think age like 31, she dies on December 5th. And I do find that pretty interesting after, what we consider to be a notable part of her life. No one really cares or finds it maybe important to note on her life or give detail or any sort of context as to uh, what happened to her, because I do think again the writing that she was being noticed for, that was definitely an important part of American history, especially the poem towards George Washington, that definitely raise some patriotism, rally troops, and not just troops, but just people across the land at the time. So yeah, that's all I've got. I'll pass it off to Kira next.
Thank you, Deja. So just curious, and maybe you didn't find this, but so there's no note about kind of like how she died?
Yeah, so every source, which I've been looking for a while, they all just say like she passed away December 5th, 31, and with, some financial troubles, which became an issue in her marriage, which I find that they could note on marriage troubles, but they couldn't note on how she died or
Right.
like the situation of her death. But yeah, it's a lot of holes at the end, of course.
That is interesting. Well, like again, that is, I think, one of the challenges of this, this period is there are usually a lot of questions that we have, and and especially with women, especially with, African women, like there's just not a lot of source material to talk about their lives. So we are left with lots more questions than answers. So, well, my lesson idea kind of is a bridge between the two we've had. So we've got a little bit of a little bit of military and battle stuff. We've got a little bit of like cultural and writers and how thought leaders at the time were influencing things. So kind of it's a way to kind of bring all these things back together. I looked at for my lesson idea Thomas Paine, and When I was looking at kind of what we had done before, we had a really great lesson idea in one of our previous newsletters that I linked to, looking at common sense. As something, of course, that is specifically mentioned in the standards that students need to be familiar with. But I wanted to look at some of the other writings of Thomas Paine, and again, think about again how they were influential, what their impact was, and maybe some passages that have resonance today, that students might want to take a look at. So, as always, we want to start with kind of a bit of context. I think it's important that students understand who Thomas Paine is before you kind of get into the writing, to understand again why any of this matters and that we still care about it today. So Thomas Paine, of course, was an influential writer, who helped to shape political ideology, especially people like George Washington. Um, Again, most famous for the writing Common Sense, which was published in early 1776, that made the argument for independence. And it was written in such a way that it wasn't written just for an elite audience, but was, used language and verbiage that would appeal to the masses. And in fact, in the first 3 months after its publication, sold over 120,000 copies. It was, again, if we think about it in today's terms, it would have been a viral hit. Like everyone had heard about it, had probably, if not had a chance to read it, probably had been to a tavern or somewhere where portions of it had been read. So again, very, very influential piece of writing during the time. He was influential not just in the American colonies, but also in France and Britain, where he advocated for democratic reforms throughout his life. Um, the American Crisis, which I focus on in this lesson idea, was published in installments, which was, fairly common in the time, beginning in December of 1776. So this is kind of one of the follow-up writings to Common Sense. And he signed each installment of the American Crisis with the pen name Common Sense. So again, as like almost like a hashtag is how you could maybe explain it to students, to again kind of building off the fame of how people would have maybe known his previous writings. And in American Crisis, he was, of course, trying to encourage patriots while at the same time chastising those who were still loyal to the crown. And so this was meant again to kind of again build support for the revolution as things move forward. In you know After the revolution, in 1787, he returns to Britain, where he writes Rights of Man, which was sort of in response to pushback that he was getting for his support for the French Revolution at the time. He was a real popular guy who was then charged with treason, and had to escape to France in 1793. Once he's in France, he's elected to the National Assembly, but again, being the popular guy that he is thrown in jail after he objects to the beheading of the king. And then it is upon the U.S. ambassador at the time, James Monroe, to help get him out of a French prison. So, which he is able to successfully, so gets Paine out of a French jail. And then in 1796 he publishes this open letter to George Washington, in which he just, eviscerates Washington for all of the corruption that he sees within the early American government. And it's really not until 1802, at the invitation of Thomas Jefferson, that Paine comes back to what is now the United States. And he dies, in 1809. So again, he went from being this man who, again, thought leader of the revolution, to very critical of George Washington, to in some ways sort of dying, as a less than popular individual. So again, very interesting kind of life of Thomas Paine. Now, again, for this lesson idea, we're focusing on the American Crisis. And so before we kind of get into, again, the writing of the, what's in the first installment of that and why that might be beneficial, it's important to kind of, again, set the stage for what was happening with the revolution in late 1776. So we know, of course, that there's the Declaration of Independence itself is signed in July. But then what is happening from July to the end of the year when the first installment of the American Crisis is published? And there's a resource that I have posted to the Padlet that I think is a great way to, again, kind of talk about what is happening at that time that I've linked here, and I'll show that to you in just a moment. But a couple of key things, again, when it's published, it is very much a low point for morale for Washington and his army, as they had suffered multiple defeats there in 1776. And it was also a time that the men who had originally enlisted in Washington's army, the time, for them to be re-enlisting was coming up. And so there's a lot of concern about just how poor morale is. The war is, we're losing battles, things aren't going well. Are men going to sign back up? Are we going to have enough people to fight the British? And so again, it's this really kind of low point early in the Revolution. So once Washington reads this after it's published in December of 1776, he he orders all of his officers to actually read this to their men prior to the famous crossing of the Delaware River in the Battle of Trenton. And it really is thought to be something that really kind of rallies the troops. And of course, then they go on to win the Battle of Trenton, which, is a really important early victory, and galvanizes support both to get men to re-enlist into the army and to continue to get support from the Continental Congress. So again, the two victories that they had in Trenton are really, really crucial at this point in time with the Revolution. So the resource that I found, so with our virtual book club this fall, we have been reading the Alexis Coe, You Never Forget Your First, which, if you're not familiar with this book, there are some really great charts and things that she does in it to kind of summarize what's going on with Washington. And so one that I thought was really cool and very, very useful is she has this multi-page kind of summary of the battles that he was leading men into as a general. And so you can see here, again, 1776, we start with the siege of Boston, and we have the outcome, which again, Washington and his troops win. Then we get into the Battle of Long Island, which they lose. Then they lose at Kips Bay. Harlem Heights is a victory, but then we lose at White Plains. Fort Washington is a loss. They have to evacuate Fort Lee. And so we can see the number of losses is definitely outweighing the number of victories. And then, of course, we could also, you could look at little summaries. We see the number of troops for each side, casualties, wounded, captured. And then when we get to, again, December 26th of 1776 in the Battle of Trenton. So this is, again, we see this series of victories that happens here between December 26th and January 3rd with the Battle of Princeton. Again, a really important turning point at this point in the war. So again, this I think is a really great way to, again, summarize quickly a lot of that military stuff, which again, yes, as Stacy mentioned, we aren't real into the military battle history. This is, I think, a great way to, again, summarize some of that for your students in a way that's, again, a little glimpse that they can get and kind of get a sense of what's going on. So with that stage set, and seeing students can kind of understand what's going on, you could move forward into introducing the text. One other thing real quick before they do that, if you want to introduce kind of a fun way to kind of, again, set the stage for what's happening, if you wanted to bring in one of the songs from Hamilton, you could play the Right Hand Man song, which is, again, from this point in the musical, kind of the content that's being covered is when we go from what's happening at the Battle of Harlem Heights, like into Battle of Trenton in that period. And I think that song does a great job of, again, talking about the odds and what's going on and, all of the things that Washington is facing at that moment. So again, you could play that. Because we're recording this, we're not going to, play the song today, but know that, again, that is there. And of course, very catchy and fun to listen to. Oh, wait. All right. So now that we can really start to look at the text itself. And so the Library of Congress, of course, has one of the publications of the crisis, and we can see is one single page. If you find the transcription, you can see the full thing. And so you want to pay attention to what you're introducing your students to. If you want to focus on just that first portion of it that was published, that the troops would have read before the crossing of the Delaware. It's really just the first two paragraphs in the transcription. So it's what you see here. this, if you're trying to read it from the library's website, it is very hard to read just from the, you know, the way it is printed and kind of the font, you know, that is used. So again, I think the transcription can be really helpful for your students, and I've linked to that here. And again, with the note, it is really just the first 2 paragraphs. And so, you know, you might want to have students to kind of skim through this, and again, think about what are some, you know, what are some things that we're seeing here that are might have been inspirational for the Patriots as they are going into their next battle. You know, what are some lines that sound familiar to us that maybe that we are familiar with? And I think, you know, it starts with, you know, this very first line: "These are the times that try men's souls." I think that's a line that most people will have heard of. Maybe they didn't realize that this is the essay from which that came. So again, I think that is really interesting. You know, and then he goes on to talk about, you know, tyranny like hell is not easily conquered, yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheap, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. And so again, you know, I think that line is really interesting, in that, you know, yes, like winning our freedom from the British and fighting this army that has way more people and way more resources is going to be difficult. But if it were easy, would we even value our freedom? And again, so I think that is a really interesting line to get students to think about and maybe discuss, you know, in terms of what it meant to the people at this time and what it might mean to us today as we again reflect on the importance of the revolutionary period and kind of shaping, you know, our nation. As it goes on, you know, he starts to comment in the second paragraph about whether the independence of the continent was declared too soon or delayed too long. So again, obviously people at the time were, you know, debating about whether we should have waited, whether we should have, you know, declared sooner. Can you imagine Americans, you know, having political debates at this time? I'm sure, you know, it's one of those moments where you're like, oh, the more things change, the more they stay the same, right? And you'll note here that there is a footnote included. So you can click on that, and that is actually the same footnote that you see right here. So again, if you're kind of curious and you can't make out what this writing is, know that that is the same thing that you see right here. So some questions that you might pose to students, again, you know, what is inspirational about this essay? How did it speak to the patriotic cause at this critical juncture in the revolution? And again, why, you know, why some of this language, how did it resonate really way beyond just the revolutionary period? You know, as you're working through this, you may want to again stop and have some discussion with students about, you know, unfamiliar vocabulary words, and really kind of work through some of the language in it. Then you may want to again think with them about, you know, what are some lines that they find particularly interesting? Where is he talking to the patriots? You know, especially into the soldiers. And to the men who are fighting this war? Where is he talking to those who are remaining loyal to the crown? And really start to really dissect what Payne is saying here. And then I think you could always then bring in, you know, the famous crossing of the Delaware painting, which again is one of those kind of cultural pieces from this time that, again, created after the fact, but has long resonance and has really kind of helped us kind of instill this moment in time in our national memory. And so again, to think about how this writing might have inspired that moment that was then captured in that painting. So hopefully, again, this gives you another way to think about bringing in Thomas Paine and some of his writing and some of the importance of, you know, some of the philosophical pieces from the Revolutionary period. If you're interested in that portion also, of course, we have a lesson plan that I think, Stacey, I think you wrote that one, the one where we did the comparison of the 3 revolutions during the period. We looked at the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the Haitian Revolution.
I don't think that was me.
Oh, maybe
It
that
may
was
have been
Layla. Okay.
Layla.
It may have been Layla. Okay.
I can't even remember what all we have and haven't done, but I think that was Layla. I think that we, as you know, we had a lot of input on it, so it felt like we all wrote it.
So let's see if I can get back to our newsletter. So just a few other things as we start to wrap up here. As Stacy mentioned, again, there's lots of things that we linked here in the important links box. Again, a small segment of things that we have available or that the Library of Congress has available. So note, again, we reference here, there is a really good resource guide that the library has, again, that just picks out some of the better things that they have for this time period. The US primary source timeline, which used to be the American Memory
Timeline, yeah.
So that has been reformatted, and they do have a section there on the Revolution. They still have the primary sources linked at the end of each of those little subsections. So again, that can be a really good resource. Again, several lesson plans that we have from preparing for Revolution, the Boston Massacre, that age of revolutions. Yeah.
And I do want to mention an additional one. The very first link within the Phyllis Wheatley lesson idea right there is to a close reading exercise that we did. So that poem that Deja took a closer look at is the one that we do a close reading exercise on. So if you're interested in kind of working through that with your students more, check out that resource. It's going to be good for that.
Yeah, and then there are several different primary source sets. There's one that the library did on Alexander Hamilton. Of course, there's a great resource guide for George Washington. And then we also linked here to the Teach T in History site because they have a section on American Revolution. And so you can bring in, again, some of those Tennessee connections into your teaching of this period. And if that's something you're interested in, actually next month on December 15th, we're going to be doing a workshop in Knoxville on Tennesseans who shaped American democracy. And we're going to be touching on, again, some of that early history. And so that might be of interest to you if you're in East Tennessee or can join us in East Tennessee on the 15th. And again, this is just a small sampling of what is available for this period. One thing that I will say, because again, there's, as Stacy mentioned, there's a lot of great paper collections. The challenge is, of course, how many of those have transcriptions. So a little cheat that I like to do if I'm looking at something and the library doesn't have a transcription available, sometimes if you Google the information that you have for the letter, like who it's from, who it's to, and the date, you can find if some other organization has developed a transcription for it. So whether that's the National Archive or, one of the other historical societies out there in the country, like a lot of those letters, especially if they're significant, you'll find transcriptions available somewhere. And so that is definitely something to kind of keep in mind when you get frustrated when the library doesn't always have transcriptions available. The other thing that I will share is that for this, especially for this time period, I have found so many wonderful sites that have just fantastic blogs that, again, can give you kind of short contextual information about things that really will kind of maybe fill in some gaps for things that are in the students' textbooks, that can help to kind of draw some connections and maybe to make some of this a little more engaging and interesting for students.
Let's show them what the fourth lesson idea is. That we are not featuring in today's episode, but it is it's tackling that that curriculum standard that talks about loyalists versus patriots. And we've done this in a past newsletter, but this is looking at the story of John Malcolm in particular. And he was a person who was a tax collector. After the Boston Tea Party, he was tarred and feathered and driven through the streets of Boston. And it's actually depicted in the John Adams miniseries that HBO did like a decade ago. If you can find clips of that on YouTube, but it may be that you don't want to show this to your students. You don't want to see, even though he's an actor, being tarred and feathered. but because the political cartoon, which I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with, is still kind of bad enough to look at, that Ken has used to kind of bring home the idea of, what would the British perspective on this type of activity be? I mean, this is not cool. But so it works in a map where you can kind of follow his tracks. It starts off with a narrative account, and then it brings in a closer look at the political cartoon. So that's when you're talking about those kind of the Stamp Act and the Tea Act and all those, the Townsend Acts and all those kinds of things leading up to the Declaration of Independence. This is a good reminder of, you can't really separate the so-called military engagements from these types of things, these acts of violence that are taking place on a smaller local level. You don't put the Boston Massacre in one category and then, a bunch of people ganging up on a tax collector doing his job in another category. It's all this kind of outpouring, all kind of being driven by the same types of, protests and kind of just the spirit of the time. You have to work your way up to the point of just in people's minds realizing, okay, we're gonna separate. Not just we're protesting things that our government is doing, but we are going to separate from the government. That's a very long process in America, which we think was like a light switch going on. It wasn't. All these tiny little steps along the way, and some of them very violent. So.
And I think, the other thing, if you're interested again in kind of reading more from this period, with our book club, we've been reading, so I mentioned the Alexis Coe book, but then also the Cookie Roberts Founding Mothers book. And both of those have some really interesting stories that kind of get into, some of the smaller events that took place. Because, I think, again, too often we think, Declaration of Independence, we signed it, we had a few battles and then poof, like, we're free and independent, everything's fine. And so to really kind of dig into what was happening in those intervening years and how the people who lived during that time experienced it, and see that through some of their writings, has been really eye-opening. So again, I would recommend taking a look at either of those books if you're interested in learning more about this period. And of course, you can find the discussions we've been having about those books on the TPS Teachers Network in the bookmarks group. Those are all posted in that group and available for anyone who is interested in kind of scanning through those questions and the responses from our readers from this time period. So with that, let me get back to Stacey. Anything else that you want to share before we wrap up?
No, that's good.
All right. So again, just a reminder, of course, we've posted all this to the Padlet so you can find the resources that we have shared, including in that document that I posted from the Coe book that showed the Washington or the battles and all the information about the battles, and then the PowerPoints that we use today. So definitely take a look at that. And again, if you are interested in receiving PD credit for participating today or for watching this recording, you can use the QR code here or the link. We send these out about once a week. So once you've completed this, give me up to about 7 days to receive your certificate. If you've not gotten it within a week, give me a shout and follow up with me to make sure we've not been an issue with Google actually recording your response. We will be back next month on the second Thursday of the month with our topic next month being the Age of Jackson. So that will be an interesting exploration into that time period. So also, if you've not had a chance to join us for any of the Discover Tennessee History webinars, those take place on the second Tuesday of the month, and you can find information about those on our TPS-MTSU website. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you next month.
A question for Stacey.
Yes.
Hi. I printed off that October newsletter for a friend,